what were the causes of the Edict of Expulsion against England's Jews in 1290? It wasn't a large community. We're not talking about many people.
I mean, in terms of what are the long-term causes, the root of it is kind of an anti-Semitism that goes back a couple of centuries. I mean, as far as we can determine, prior to the Norman conquest of 1066, there were no Jewish communities in England. There is simply no record of it. And the first evidence we have is a chronicler called William of Malmesbury writing in the 1120s, who says the first Jewish community set up in London came over as a result that were brought over from Normandy by William the Conqueror. So you have Jews living in English towns and cities from the late 11th century onwards. And it's something I've touched upon already, because they were able to lend money at interest. They were extremely useful in the first instance to the crown. So when the king needed money, he could tap his Jewish subjects, and sort of he had a kind of parasitic relationship with them that he could kind of, just sort of, I'm not sure that's quite the right word, but I'm trying to describe the king as a parasite, obviously, not his Jewish subject. But he would sort of, take money from them whenever he wanted. And in the knowledge that, he might not have to pay it back, or they could always make more money. So he sort of, he protected the Jewish community, the king, but he also sort of abused it, if you like, whenever he wanted, by sort of saying, well, you're my, the Jews were regarded rather like serfs, although they might be prosperous. The king had power over them. He could say, essentially, you're mine. They were referred to as the king's Jews. So he could take their money whenever, the occasion demanded. So that meant he had to protect them. So they are simultaneously kind of exploited. That's a better word than abused. They were exploited by the king. But because he wanted to protect them for his own purposes, they were protected. And that's why they tended to these communities tended to be under the shadow of royal castles. So if there were any sort of stirrings of virulent anti-Semitism, they would be protected by the sheriff and quickly taken inside the walls of a fortress. So there's always this very sort of odd relationship from the first, that they are, say, both protected and exploited. And, there are occasions when it suits politicians or kings to whip up fury against minorities. We've already talked about crusades. Right. So there's all that background that explains why the Jews in medieval England were both considered necessary and regarded with the same sort of loathing that periodically spills out when people talk about financial institutions today, or banks. It's kind of like, of course you have to have these, but they can be the bad guys when you fall into financial difficulty. If you overspend, if you can't you can't repay your mortgage, then it's the bank's fault. So that's why they attract this kind of vitriol. There's also that can be I think that's for most people what it boils down to, but that can be fanned and fed by theological issues. So if the church says, well, these guys aren't so bad, they're wrong, but they prove that we're right. That's kind of one kind of tolerant attitude to having Jewish communities living in your midst from Christian clerics in the Middle Ages. If the clergy, from kind of like the bishops downwards, start saying, these guys are terrible and you shouldn't mix with them and you should make them wear badges, which is what happens in 13th century England. The expressions from the Christian clergy are increasingly anti-Semitic and virulent. Of course, that permeates down and it becomes not just the acceptable thing to do, but the right thing to do in the minds of the elite and by extension, the rest of the population.